Hi, welcome back, everyone. Hi, Ken.
Hey Ellie, great to be back after that long break.
Yeah, summer shenanigans got in the way of our recording, so it's nice to be back. And there certainly has not been a lack of things to talk about. So we're going to try to knock a few ideas off one by one. So I thought maybe what we would start with today is something that I sent you a message about with one of my students, where they decided to broaden their perspectives and picked up a couple of books that are talking about some of the other, I guess you would say, sides of the argument, if you believe in sides, or just another narrative altogether. And she was looking at Ilan Pappe's book, which is called The Ethnic Cleansing of the Palestinians. And the sort of original claim of this book, his sort of central thesis, is that the 1948 war was not a conflict, but a premeditated campaign of ethnic cleansing of the Palestinians by the Israeli forces in order to establish a Jewish state. That's really like what he's asserting. And then he gives all kinds of proofs and historical, background to that. And so she was like, I don't really know what to do with this. I'm not sure how to understand these historical pieces that he's bringing forth. And we're the Jews really awful people, and we just don't talk about that. So can we just throw that on the table and understand it a little bit? I think there's lots to dig into there. So where should we start?
So I think we need to start with when you're dealing with someone like Ilan Pappe. I love when people bring out a Jew as proof that the Jews are bad, whether it's Norman Finkelstein, who I've tried to debate and who basically had a meltdown and hung up on me, or
Mm-hmm.
Noam Chomsky, or just because, first of all, number one is just because a person is Jewish doesn't mean he has more credibility, he's more of a scholar, or somehow that gives him more weight, even though it sounds better to have a Jew criticizing the state of Israel. You also have to understand a little bit about Ilan Pappe, who doesn't even live in Israel anymore. I believe he's a professor at Exeter University. He left Israel, I think, in 2008 after being criticized and condemned by the Knesset. But he was a member of Hadassah, which was the Communist Party of Israel. His religion is not traditional Judaism. And his starting point is it speaks mountains about his whole perspective because he basically believes in his worldview that the Jewish people are a religion and not a people. And that then leads into the whole basic point that we are the foreign occupiers who have stolen the land from the indigenous Arab Palestinian population, which is a lie built on a lie built on another lie. And again, lacks a lot of factual historical context about, again, the Jewish people's connection to the land of Israel, who we are as a people. We are a people, the Arab Islamic connection to the land of Israel, the centrality of Israel and Jerusalem to the Jewish people versus the Arab Islamic world. So there's a lot of things that we've touched on in the course of our discussions multiple
Yeah, so I
times.
think if anybody, those bullet points that you've already pointed out, these are topics of past episodes. So if anybody wants to go back and look at any of those ideas, we've covered them extensively. But how do they play into this particular narrative that he's asserting?
Right. So first of all, we have to, I mean, we do need to mention, without going to the whole point, that we are a nation. We had a presence in the land of Israel for a very long period of time that goes back more than 3,000 years ago. We don't want to get into debate of whether the biblical account we want to accept is historically accurate. Obviously, traditional Jewish and Christian take on it is that it is, but there's no question that the Jews are a people. We are also a religion, which is why people get confused. We have a land, a language, and a history. And the early part of our history, up until really, a little more than 2000, a little less than 2,000 years ago, we were centered overwhelmingly in the land of Israel. But through a series of events, an exile that we just had Tisha B'Av yesterday. We had the destruction 2,500 years ago
Right.
of the first temple and the exile of the kingdom of Judah. We returned after 70 years. We had a second commonwealth of four. We destroyed by the Romans. And then we had the Bar Kokhba revolt in the 2nd century. This is all stuff people can research on their own or go back to listen to previous episodes. But the simple way of explaining it, besides the fact that we are an ancient people who are the indigenous population of the land of Israel, with one little caveat, the only people who could be more indigenous to what we call Israel of today would be Canaanites.
Mhm.
who no longer exist as an independent people. As of literally thousands of years ago, they disappeared. But we are the oldest surviving indigenous population of the land of Israel. And yes, we, through no fault of our own, were thrown out of our land and exiled around the world, but our historical ethnic roots are in the Middle East, even though some of us have lost our melanin and are a lot more European looking than our Sephardic Mizrahi cousins. So that's like such an important point, because this is something that he's beginning, the way a historian or writer begins, it's based on certain assumptions that are patently false, that we're the
Right.
foreigners who, and our history begins here with Zionism, which is an
I thought it
illegitimate
was
movement.
right. I thought it was so funny. I saw some the other, I think yesterday or the day before, that said, we're about to go into Tisha B'Av, and Iran keeps threatening to attack us on Tisha B'Av because we're in a day of mourning. And what are we mourning for? We're mourning for the loss of the first and second Jewish temple, which basically proves Jewish indigeneity, which is what they're saying doesn't exist. So it's like, it's such a crazy argument. Like, we know that Tisha B'Av is important for you because you've been celebrating it for 2,000 years, but you weren't in the land 2,000 years ago. It's just crazy making.
Right. And there's, you can be like Adolf Hitler and Dr. Goebbels and do the big lie and just deny reality. But there's no serious debate over the issue that we are a people and our homeland is the land of Israel, that we have been obsessed with that land. Zionism, which is a modern national expression of the ancient Jewish yearning to be in the land of Israel, because the most basic promise that God gives the Jewish people is, to your seed, I will give this land. So we're kind of Israel obsessed. We've been praying about returning for thousands of years. And of course, our connection to Jerusalem, which is mentioned 669 times in the Hebrew Bible, and Zion is mentioned 158 times. And every Jew in the world is praying towards Jerusalem. We pray for the return to Jerusalem and the rebuilding of the temple. And I mean, we break a glass at a wedding because, I always say jokingly, some people think that's the last time the guy gets to put his foot down. But we're mourning the loss of the temple and our central
Right.
religious and political capital. So there's no point in like beating this one to death again, but this
Right.
is a plan. This is so important that we begin an understanding of who we are as a nation with an ancient connection. And Zionism is merely our return to our ancient homeland,
Right.
which was sanctioned by the nations of the world basically around the time of the pretty much beginning with World War I is when Zionism begins in the late 19th century, but international support for that begins in the early 20th century around the time of World War I and continues all the way through to post-World War II. So even if you would argue somehow that we lost the country and we have no right to come back and reclaim it, you have to say that those international bodies such as the League of Nations and the United Nations have multiple times reaffirmed the Jewish people's right to a homeland. So we have to just push
And a right to
that
the
one
to a homeland in our homeland, which is
in the
that
land
piece
of
of land
Israel.
that we're in. So that's undisputable in that way. So let's go to, like, what are some of the things that Ilan Pappe uses as proofs for this narrative? Because I think he's, seemingly brings all of these historical proofs, these battles, these times where, the Israelis or the Jewish people that were living on the land at the time removed or moved Arab populations. What are we dealing with here? Is how much of it is real? How much of it is skewed by a certain narrative where he's trying to really throw the Jewish people under the bus because he fundamentally feels that we shouldn't be there? And how much of it is stuff that we just really have to reconcile ourselves with, where that's what happened?
Yeah. So I think we have to realize that like two things can be true at once. Israel is not a perfect country, and countries in wartime do things that obviously are not the best things to do necessarily. But that's like George Patton said, or William Tecumseh Sherman said it: "War is hell." War is hell. And Israel was fighting in 1948. It actually starts with the UN partition vote of 1947, when the British basically decide they're going to be gone within less than half a year. And they kind of turn their back on the situation they didn't want to deal with, which is why they pulled out in the first place, which is the tension that was between the Jews and the Arabs in what was called Palestine at the time. So the background to all of this is I mean, we have to rewind actually a little further than that. All ancient history issues aside, we know that during World War I, when the Ottoman
Mm,
Turks were controlling what today is the land of Israel, which, by the way, they didn't call Palestine. The Europeans were calling it Palestine. The Ottoman
right.
Turks was like Greater Syria for them. But the British were actively involved in trying to get the Jews, the smaller Jewish population, which is already starting to return from
Mhm.
the late 19th century, and the larger Arab population in the Middle East to help them against the Turks with promises of some sort of creation of national statehood for both the larger Arab population and the Jewish Arab population. I mean, the Jewish population of Palestine. You have to read things like the Balfour Declaration, and all these things were happening during the war. And post World War I, we had the Treaty of San Remo in 1920, which everyone should read about because that's when the victorious Allied powers got together to basically divide up what was formerly the Ottoman Turkish Empire, which no longer existed, into spheres of influence: French mandate, British mandate, Mesopotamia, which is the area of Iraq, and artificially created any number of states: Jordan, Iraq, Syria, Lebanon, in which they also, the British mandate was to create a Jewish homeland, which they'd already promised in the Balfour Declaration going back to World War One.
Right.
And that was a large piece of real estate, by the way, much larger than what we have of the state of Israel of today. But immediately after the Treaty of San Remo in 1920, the British, who basically for various reasons it's not worth going into now, started to backpedal on the promises to the Jews, recognizing that their interest in the Suez Canal and oil and the
Right.
larger Arab population, significantly larger, it was more important to please those people. So they lopped off 75% of what was supposed to be a Jewish state on the east bank of the Jordan and created a country called Transjordan, which became an independent state not that much before Israel became a state in
Which we now
48.
know as Jordan.
Right, which, by the way, in contradiction to the British, their own regulations, was made Judenrein, Jew-free.
Right.
And they're creating all these different countries. So there's an international political process that's going on basically between World War I and World War II to create what's called the modern Middle East. And then, of course, we have
Right.
World War II. And as a byproduct of World War II, afterwards, it didn't look, the British, by the way, on the eve of World War II, already decided to limit Jewish immigration to the land of Israel in 1939 to 15,000 Jews for the next 5 years, and then no more Jewish immigration. So literally on the eve of World War II, when Jews had no place to go and were trapped in Europe, the British were keeping the Jews out of their national historic homeland, which led to that Aliyah Bet movement of trying to get into the land of Israel, which the British called illegal immigration.
Right.
And then, of course, we have the rise of Arab nationalism, which is appearing at the same time, and the import of another thing that everyone should research is the Mufti Haj al-Min al-Husseini, who spent 3 years in Germany during the war hanging out with Adolf Hitler, who imported all the traditional European anti-Semitism and blood libels and horrible Jewish demonization and hatred into the collective consciousness of the Arab Middle East, which was
And the
like
reason
throwing
they were
lighter
able to
fluid
do
on
right. The reason they were able to do that was because there was already their own version of anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish sentiment related to the belief that Islam is the ultimate end of all ends in terms of the religion that is relevant and real right now. So it's replacement theology. I'm super
exactly.
curious also, like, was there a population swap, right? There were certain places, especially if we think about, say, India and Pakistan, where they literally moved populations in order to create two separate countries. And that Britain just sort of did of its own will. So when they created the map of the modern Middle East, was there a population swap? And were Arabs told to go to a certain place and Jews told to go to a certain place?
No, there's nothing like the India-Pakistan thing took place in Israel, because if we fast forward through that process, so the British already lop off 75% and create Transjordan, and that remaining piece of land, which is today, Israel and what's the disputed territories, Judea, Samaria, and Gaza, that had a significant Arab population, which was actually larger. In like 1945, the Arab population of what was that whole territory, Israel and the territories, was slightly more than twice as big as the Jewish population. The Jewish population was increasing dramatically, but there was still a significant Arab population. So the British, in contradiction to everything that had been decided earlier at San Remo and you name it, decided now we're going to throw it onto the UN. So everything's out the window. All the internationally recognized agreements that created all those Arab states were honored,
Right.
and including creating that 75% of the territory Transjordan state, which becomes the Hashemite Kingdom of Jordan. But with the remaining little piece of 23% of the land, we're now going to subdivide it even smaller into based on where the populations of Arabs were in that land and Jews were in the land. And you can look at maps of the partition plan, the UN partition plan, November 29th, 1947, which, and this is the beginning of the whole process we're getting to now, which the Jews, there's no Jewish state yet, the Jewish agency, which later becomes the functional Jewish government after the War of Independence when the British leave, we accepted it, even though it was, now we're down to like 15% of the original territory that was promised to us. And we're going to have like 22 Arab states created out of all of this. So we accepted it. And this is the real issue here is, and this is the point I always make, had the Arab world accepted the partition plan, which was voted on by the United Nations, which was the international body that had the right to sanction the creation of, they're the ones who are creating everything else in the Middle East. If you throw out all these other things that the Allied powers decided on, then you have to throw out all the borders of the Arab states today because they're all illegitimate. But
Right.
legitimacy was given to all these states, and legitimacy was not given to a Jewish state. And then what we were left with, which is the 15% or so, the Arab world rejects it in 40, when the UN votes in 47, they reject this. We didn't even mention, by the way, Ellie, the fact that the foreign invaders to what is the Levant, which is a fancy word for the Middle East, the northwest part of that, are the Arabs who only show up. There's no debating this in the 7th century. This is already 6 centuries after the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem and the exile of the majority of the Jewish population. Right. So their presence is much more recent. And obviously they ended up populating and mixing with the indigenous populations of North Africa, the Middle East, and what is called Mesopotamia, which is Iraq. So they came much later onto the stage.
Which we talk about in one of our episodes where we talk about the Arab colonization of the Middle East, which is a really important thing to understand if you're thinking about the region as a whole in terms of land, but the region as a whole also in terms of time and history. So who owns all that land? Is it really indigenous to Arabs and Islam? It's not.
It's not indigenous. And Israel didn't take the maximalist argument that this is our traditional homeland and we're going to do some ethnic cleansing on you guys and chuck you all out. Israel said, fine, we will. We have, even within the partition of the UN, the Israeli territory, there were Arab populations living within that area that Israel didn't say you have to get out. Right. But the Arab world basically, and remember, there's no Palestinian state that exists before that went out of existence. It was previous to it being Jordanian or Egyptian occupied after the War of Independence. It was controlled by the British, and previous to that, it was part of the Ottoman Turkish Empire, and previous to that, it was part of an earlier Islamic, not necessarily Arab empire, because the Turks are not Arabs, they're Muslims. And then in the middle, you had the Crusaders for less than a century, and then a couple of other Islamic empires, and then it goes back to the Byzantines, then to the Romans, then to the Jews. So it's just different empires that are controlling that piece of real estate. So there's no Palestinian state that pre-existed trying to come back into existence. And as we mentioned before, the only people who called themselves Palestinians prior to the War of Independence in May of 1948 were the Jews living there. The Arabs who lived in what is today those territories and Israel call themselves Arabs. But basically, that was a long-winded lead up to the question you were basically asking, that first of all, had the Arab world accepted a Jewish presence on whatever little land the British left the Jewish population, there would have been no conflict at all. That's such an important point to understand. But they rejected. The British turned their back more or less on the situation, even though they're still technically responsible until May 14th, 1948. The Arabs population, with the backing of foreign Arab forces, starts attacking. It was conquer and divide and conquer strategy. Let's cut the road off between Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. The Arab villages on the hills that today are no longer there because of this point. were used as points of attacking to attack the convoys trying to get food and water to Jerusalem. The road between the Gush Etzion block in the south, which was land that was bought in the 1930s for Jewish settlement, that road is cut.
So what
The
you're
road, the
saying is,
Galilee.
so what you're saying is that the Arabs that are in the land embark on a crusade of guerrilla warfare to try to make it impossible for the Jewish population to continue to live and exist there peacefully, safely, et cetera, et cetera. So,
Exactly.
so does the Jewish population fight back? And I think this is where Ilan Pappe's book kind of tries to focus on is the response. And can you tell us a little bit about what he cites a lot, this idea of Plan Dalet? What is that? And how do we understand that today?
So Plan Dalet, which is basically the beginning of the war, it's prior to the War of Independence. Israel already knows what's coming.
Mm-hmm.
So they have, remember, this is Jewish community that's isolated in one part of the Galilee along the coastal plain, in Jerusalem, and in certain areas to the south. It's a plan we have to solidify our control of certain areas to guarantee the safety and security of Jewish communities. So again, so Ilan Pappe painted as a genocidal plan to ethnically cleanse the Arab population. And again, we go back to the point that had these communities not been threatened, there'd be no need to, and part of that Plan Dalet was, yes, to, like, for instance, Jerusalem-Tel Aviv highway is a great example of that. You had Arab villages all along the hills there. They're not there today because they were used staging points for attacking convoys. You can still see as you drive up road number 1, the remains of several of these convoys around the area of what's called Shah Hagai when we start to go up into the mountains and you go up and then the hills get very steep on the other side and the road was very narrow. It was a great ambush point, a choke point for traffic to Jerusalem on the only road. So absolutely, the army went in. This was even happening prior to the British are still in the country. This road is cut off while the British are still there. So they're really responsible for allowing.
So you're saying the Arabs cut it off.
Yeah.
The Israelis start to respond saying we can't survive if our roads keep being cut off and blocked from food and water and supplies.
Existential threats all throughout the land of Israel. And they always talk about the cycle of violence. I hate that term. There's no example that I could think of Israel starting something. It's always a reaction to, and then the Arabs respond back, and then Israel responds back. So then you get into the cycle, but Israel's not instigating. The notion that somehow Israel launches this genocidal war of ethnic cleansing in the land of Israel is nonsense on so many levels.
So what was it then? What was the plan for Plan Dalet?
The plan was basically to any place which is being used, communities that are being used as launching points to attack the Jewish communities for strategic reasons. We have to be cleaned out, and it doesn't mean everyone loves to point to Deir Yassin, which was when the Irgun went in and there was a battle, and it's much debated what exactly happened. The other side likes to claim that they went in and took people out, and women, and they raped them and they shot people. That's a gross exaggeration. That civilians were killed in the fighting definitely seems to be the case. But that it was this deliberate plan to basically slaughter. And even then, Israel still, it could have been that the Jewish fighters did stuff that maybe didn't need to be done. And maybe they did overreact. And maybe there was some unnecessary shooting of civilians. No one even knows until today. But to kind of extrapolate out of that was the policy that was going on, and that somehow massive numbers of Arabs were slaughtered is simply not true. The background too, when we finally get to the War of Independence and the British leave, and David Ben-Gurion calls for peace, you can go read his speech when he declares Israel a state, calls for peaceful coexistence, both the Arabs within the Jewish territories and the surrounding Arab states. And the Arab reaction is the Egyptian Air Force bombs Tel Aviv 2 hours later, and 5 Arab armies declare war and invade. The plan was basically, we're going to divide and conquer and drive the fledgling Jewish state it's going to be stillborn. We're going to slaughter and push it into the sea.
Right.
That's what that was going to be. So we see they're the ones who launched this war for the complete destruction of the Jewish state. Now, you can go into every single battle and every single community, this operation there and that operation there. But the bottom line is And again, there's some gray area in there. It's not 100% one way or another way. But had they not started this conflict, there would have been no refugee issue. But as to the actual refugees, first of all, always in war, people will move out of a conflict zone. That's number one. Because civilians don't want to be in the middle of fighting. So in many places, the Arab population will move away. They were definitely, without going into all the details, encouraged by Arab leaders also to move out of the way because civilians are in the way. Step aside, we'll slaughter the Jews, and you can come back and not only get your stuff back, you'll get their stuff back also.
Right.
So many of these Arab populations left willingly, believing that there was going to be an Arab victory, which seemed like logical. Arms embargo in the Middle East. Israel had no air force, no tanks, no navy. 5 Arab armies, including the Jordanian Legion, which was British run. John Glove, right. Pasha John Glove. British equipped and British trained, the best Arab army in the Middle East. And there were definitely, like the Plan Dalet and things, definitely situations in which Israel went and absolutely cleaned out whole villages even of their population.
Is there a fair comparison? Because I mean, look, we, as a Jewish people, and as you said, we're not people who instigate. We're not we're not an empire building country. We're not trying to take over any of the land outside of our borders. We're really just trying to existentially survive in the land that we have. So when you talk about going in and clearing out areas, is it a fair comparison to say similar to what we're doing right now in Gaza, where we're trying to go into places and get rid of Hamas infrastructure and places that are being used to, throw rockets and to attack Israel from? Is that a fair comparison? In terms of Plan Dalet, was that a similar idea? We're going to go into these places where they're launching attacks and stop their capability to attack us. And when we get to gray areas, what do we do with that?
Yeah, so I mean, the fast forward to, again, the most important comparison and connection to make is the fact that had Hamas not, and completely unprovoked, launched a massive missile barrage and then slaughtered, raped, and pillaged, 1,200 Israelis, right, 2/3 of whom are civilians, and then kidnapped people, none of it would have happened. So there's this is no arguing this. Had the Arabs not, been attacking before the British left and then tried to destroy Israel after the British left, there would have been no reaction. There was no plan in advance. And Ilan Pappe cannot prove this because he's just making it up. That Israel sits down and goes, okay, even if the Arabs are peaceful and quiet, we're going to go in and clean them out. And so the
question for me, which is fascinating, which is like you said, with what army? With what, like Israel's barely holding it together. They're half the size of the population. How would they even think this wasn't the IDF as we know it today. This is a bunch of straggling socialist, Tel Aviv people who are just simply there wasn't an army. Is that correct? Because we have this perception through the lens of today.
Well, Israel had an army, absolutely. It was definitely under-equipped, but I think it's like Golda Meir said, I don't know, I think it's a line from her that the Arabs can afford to lose. We can't afford to lose one war, because we lose one war, we're finished. So right, we're fighting for our survival, and we're under-equipped, although a lot of people have made the argument that despite the fact that we were outnumbered by the Arab armies and they were better equipped, that they were definitely not coordinating their attacks in Israel. Using our Jewish brains, we did some pretty cool things. So it wasn't like it was impossible for us to do what we did. Even if we were outgunned, it's still you could argue that we could go into villages and clean out civilian populations because they're completely unarmed, basically, unless there were hotbeds like you have Hamas hiding within the civilian population in the tunnels while they're using their civilian population as human shields. But again, the issue that we really have to focus on is that both what Hamas and the Arab world and the local Arab population within the land of Israel as territory had in common was the complete destruction of the Jewish population. Even if it meant slaughtering that population. They both had that as mind as a goal, and they were in both cases, they're the instigators of it. So what Israel is doing now, people were talking about, even though, we could talk about Israel has the lowest civilian in Gaza today, Israel has the lowest civilian to combatant population ratio that ever in any battle, and probably what is the most difficult urban warfare situation ever. All things aside, every Jewish casualty, every Israeli casualty, and every Palestinian Gazan casualty is solely the fault of Hamas, just as any refugee problem or Arab casualties, even in a place like Deir Yassin, where it's a little grayer about exactly what happened, is solely, this is the point about. There's no plan to ethnically cleanse. And how do we know that is true, by the way, until today? Because we know that, in 1948, there was a little over 600,000 Jews living in the territory that was supposed to be the Jewish area, what was left of original mandate.
Right.
And there was like 150,000 Arabs who became citizens of Israel, who have now grown to a population of close to 2,100,000 Arabs. Who are citizens of the land of Israel, who have rights, that there are definitely social issues, but it's not like apartheid, another word that has been gutted of its meaning, as genocide has been gutted of its meaning because it's being misused, like the boy who cried wolf, he used the term incorrectly. After a while, it has no meaning. I mean, we're terrible. And first of all, if we were so into getting rid of the Arab population, we would have cleansed ourselves of the Arabs living within our borders, which we not only didn't do, but that population has gone up from 150,000 to over 2 million. And even though, and by the way, Israel, after the fighting in 48 and 67, because of two attempts to destroy the Jewish state, which were started by Arab armies from the outside, which did lead to, when Israel takes over Judea and Samaria, which was illegally occupied by Jordan for 19 years, where there was no UN resolutions condemning that illegal occupation, there definitely were large populations of Arabs who fled from a lot of these places. By the way, Moshe Dayan goes to the border, the international border, the Allenby, and he tells the Arabs, no, stay here, don't leave. There was a great opportunity when the Arabs would en masse have left those territories, but we know that Israel estimates that there was, I don't know, like 650,000 refugees in total. I believe the UN, by the way, estimated after the War of Independence, the number they came up with about 450,000. It's ironic that Israel came up with a higher number based on what was there before and what was there after.
Right.
The UN came up with a lower number, but of that, this is such a wild thing. Of that Arab population that was in 1945, I've seen the statistics. The British did a very detailed survey of the Jewish, Muslim, and other population of what they called Palestine in 45. And they came up with a number that was about 1,060,000. And given the fact that definitely hundreds of thousands of Arabs left, today we know that, forget the 2 million Arabs living in Israel proper who are citizens of Israel, there's an estimated 2 million citizens of Gaza and 3 million citizens in the territory. So there's 5 million people. So even minus the refugees who may have fled to Arab states, who have never been absorbed by them deliberately so they can be used to delegitimize Israel. That whole issue aside, the Arab population of the territories has gone from 1 million to 5 million. So we suck at ethnic cleansing and genocide. I mean, the population's gone up 5 times since then. Right. So these are things that no one talks about. Like, no one talks about. Israel could easily, if it wanted to, go in and clean out Judea and Samaria of its Arab population. We could have done it in 67. We could have done
it. We could have finished off Gaza in a week. That if we really wanted to just get rid of everybody, it's definitely within our capabilities to do. I have a question though. Yeah. When you mentioned about Moshe Dayan going and saying, "Don't leave," what was he thinking? Why was he saying to them, "Don't leave"?
He's thinking that, we can live side by side in peace. He's thinking that it's not right that we display, you're here, you should be, it comes from a good place.
But where did he get that idea? If they were under attack, if they were making it difficult, are you saying that there was, on the whole, Jews and Arabs living peacefully, and it was more the outliers that were attacking? Like, where would he even get that idea? Was he in reality?
I don't think he had a vision of, there definitely are Israelis there are communities, and you find them in Haifa, and there's a few places where you literally have Jews and Arabs living like in the same schools. One thing people don't appreciate that the Israeli Arabs, forget the Palestinians who don't identify as whatever in any connection to Israel, even Israeli Arabs who are citizens of Israel, Muslims and a smaller Christian population, live separate. When you live in America or Canada, which are melting pots, you can go to elementary school where people are from all different ethnicities. You have like,
Right.
English descent and Irish descent and Italian descent and African descent and Asian descent, and everyone's
Yeah, for
mixing
sure.
in and speaking
When
English.
I went to public school when I was growing up, there were like 20 different countries represented in my class every
Yep.
year.
Right, right. And not only that, even though at different periods of time, like, like my ancestors came in 4 generations ago to America speaking Yiddish, and, the next generation born and raised in America, who are my grandparents, they may have known enough Yiddish to know when their parents were speaking about them and didn't want them to understand.
Right.
But their first language is English, and they totally assimilate and acculturate into that larger culture. And you see that in America, Little Italy and Chinatown and Hell's Kitchen and the Lower East Side as kind of separate little, like, little ethnic areas. But fast forward, 50, 75, 100 years later, and it's gone, and everyone's mixed. But people don't realize is, even in the land of Israel, there are a few places like Haifa, which are mixed places, and you have Jaffa, which has a mixed Jewish Arab population. But pretty much, with very few exceptions, the Arab minority populations are educated in their own schools. Their first language is, they usually know Hebrew, especially if they're citizens of Israel, to learn Hebrew, but they speak Hebrew with an Arabic accent.
Right.
I've heard Arabs who speak Hebrew with no accent, but it's rare. And they tend to maintain a separate identity. So I don't know enough about Moshe Dayan's thinking to know if he was thinking about, we're going to create a melting pot in the land of Israel. But it probably came from the place of believing that, you're here and stay here and we'll get along.
Right.
It's a very common thing that the West thinks
Right.
about, just absorb into Europe today. Let's absorb millions of very particularist Islamic immigrants from all these Arab Middle East and other places in the Middle East who may not be
Right.
Arabs. And they'll just assimilate, but they don't realize these people are very particularistic and want to preserve their own identity. And in the place of Europe today, they actually want to actually demographically overwhelm the indigenous population of Europe and take over their country.
Well, I think it was also a risky proposition, but also understandable because, we keep trying to microtize as if Israel's the biggest country in the Middle East and everything else dwarfs it, which is like insane. Like Israel, like we said, is a matchbox in a football field in the Middle East. So, to Moshe Dayan, the Arabs that are within the land proper are part of a huge swath of the Middle East that he's surrounded by, all of which are Arabs. Like, we're the minority in the Middle East. We're not, people think about white colonizers as if Israel's trying to like, we're the minority in the Middle East. We are the small indigenous population of a New Jersey-sized piece of land within an enormous region, all of which has Islamic or Muslim or Arab rule. Totally, a different perspective. So it's interesting to me that he would say stay, because it speaks to his idea that, hey, we're here to be part of the Middle East. We want to try to figure out how to make this work, and recognizing that that's going to be necessary in order for it to work.
Exactly. And also comes from it's not in the Jewish, like neshama, as we said, Jewish soul to be into slaughtering, expelling. We don't do this stuff. Eric Hoffer is an American social thinker from the mid 20th century. He said Jews are the only people in the world who expect it to actually act like Christians.
Right.
But it comes from a place of like, okay, you guys are living here amongst us. Okay, you're not Jewish, but Israel's a democratic and Jewish state, which is, how can that be? How many countries in the world are democracies that have state? France is a Catholic country. England has the Anglican Church. You can actually do both. One, not a zero-sum game. Israel has this 20% Arab minority, and other minorities who are living here, Christians and whatever, some of them are Arab, some of them are not, that live in the Jewish state with rights, but there's no contradiction between those ideas. And I'm sure that much of the founding fathers of the state of Israel were happy to, and Ben-Gurion talks about this also, and you see Herzl writing about what the new Middle East is going to be like. Trains running from, to rail lines going from, Jerusalem to Damascus, and it's going to be just a happy place. So we don't want, we just, not in our Jewish, this is what I really can't stand about a guy like Ilan Pappe, like that. We are the nicest people. We're always turning the other cheek and doing things that are actually detrimental to our own safety and security, because it comes from a place of always looking in a positive way towards other people and wanting to peacefully coexist with them, which is, I'm sure, what Diane was thinking about. But the other thing, Ellie, that was completely ignored is the real ethnic cleansing that took place in the Middle East, which is there's an estimated 820 to 850,000 Jews living between North Africa, the Middle East, out to, and that doesn't even include Iran, which is not an Arab state, that were living there. Many of them were there. The Jewish community of Iraq of today goes back 2,500 years. And that's literally more than 1,000 years before any Arabs came to Iraq with the spread of Islam in the 7th century.
Right.
Between 48 and 1967, all of these countries ethnically cleansed, true ethnic cleansing, unprovoked, because of what was going on in Israel and the Middle East between 48 and 67.
Meaning either killed or expelled their entire Jewish population.
Some were killed. The majority were not killed, but there were pogroms in Iraq. There were definitely anti-Jewish violence in all of these places. These people who, by the way, had accumulated a lot of wealth, because Jews tend to be on the high end in these Arab countries, business-wise and things. They left with nothing. They fled in many cases. Sometimes they bought them out, like in places like Morocco, by Jews. There's interesting stories of how they were airlifted out. Deals were made of over 800,000 Jews, of whom more than 500,000 were settled in Israel. So is in the right of the, even if you take the maximalist number of Arab refugees, Palestinian refugees from Israel, who left for various reasons, it wasn't all driven out deliberately, but it still is hundreds of thousands of people less than was driven out deliberately from Jews living in the Arab homeland, losing a lot more. And the difference was that Israel absorbed these people, and they became the Sephardic Mizrahi community of what is Israel today, which is such a huge percentage of the population of the state of Israel. And the Arabs, whatever refugees who left for whatever reasons, forced out, chose to leave, whatever, were deliberately not absorbed and have been kept festering literally for like 80 years.
So there's a reason I want to focus on this piece of intention, meaning when we talk about things like Plan Dalet, right? There's a difference between state-sanctioned ethnic cleansing with a clear and stated intention to rid your population of a certain people, right? Like in Hamas's charter, it clearly states that part of their governmental policy is to rid the land of Jews forever. I don't think, as far as I understand, we've seen a governmental state-sanctioned policy of ethnic cleansing of Arabs or Palestinians in Israel. I think we can't deny, as you said, that sometimes in the fog of war, things are done that are not in line with our values. And certainly we can't account for people's mental state and for the hate in their hearts where perhaps they'll do terrible things. We know they've done them both against prime ministers and Jews in Israel, as well as against potentially Arabs. But I want to try to make a difference between state-sanctioned ethnic cleansing and people who either go rogue or are caught in the fog of war. Is it fair to say that Israel does not have a policy or a governmental paradigm of our job is to get rid of all the Palestinian Arabs?
So again, clearly based on the reality of the demographics of Israeli Arabs and the Palestinian Arab population, clearly there was no policy of ethnic cleansing. And I would tweak what you said slightly. It's more than just the fog of war and how people behave and things get out of hand. The Plan Dalet was the safety and security of Jewish communities in certain places. Right. So the destruction of any Arab communities, villages, and the exiling of those populations were a means to an ends, because those populations were being aggressively trying to attacking Jewish communities or trying to cut off roads. Right. So it wasn't
a response to an existential threat.
Right. It's a byproduct. Right.
Okay, got it.
It's a byproduct of an attempt to secure communities. And again, going back to the beginning statement, had they not been belligerent and being used as launching points and attacked the Jewish communities, it wouldn't have happened. So it wasn't like just occasionally soldiers lost control. No, there was definitely situations where Israel decided, like on the Jerusalem-Tel Aviv highway, we are cleaning out these villages because these populations are incredibly hostile to us, and they're being launched as staging points. And no one else in the world would do anything different, by the way. This
Right.
is, if they'd been quiet, nothing happened. Go to Abu Ghosh. Abu Ghosh, that's a great example. Whereas all these different communities where Shoresh is, and there's a bunch of different places that are now Jewish communities that are built, some of them in areas where there were Arab area neighborhoods and villages before. There's a straddling the Jerusalem-Tel Aviv highway is an Israeli Arab town called Abu Ghosh. Literally, you come down from Telstone, Kiryat Yarim, and you cross it. It's a huge Arab town. They made a strategic decision. They're straddling the Jerusalem-Tel Aviv highway. They could have been a real thorn in the side of Israel because they were right on either side of that road. You see it today.
Right.
They decided they're not going to start up. They're not going to participate. And now Abu Ghosh is, big, huge Arab town, which is in the Guinness Book of World Records for having the biggest plate of hummus ever made. So it's an Israeli
Wow.
Arab town, and a lot of
Fascinating.
Israelis go and hang out there, and they're famous for their hummus. So you can
Right.
see, had the policy been, we're going to ethnically cleanse, Abu Ghosh wouldn't be there today. And it would be a nice
Right.
Jewish neighborhood right outside Jerusalem. You
Right.
can't argue these facts. So that there was definitely decisions made on a military level, not because things got out of hand. We're going to clean these places out because they're hotbeds of staging points for attacks against Israel. But that's the mean to the ends. The ends is securing Jewish communities, ensuring the survival of a Jewish state. Fact, fact, fact. And if you have the broader picture, you see this is 100% clear. Whereas fact, 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 you can sing Azam Pasha, Secretary General of the Arab League in 1947, is calling for the massacre and the slaughter of Jews in the land of Israel. The
Right.
ends is the destruction of a Jewish presence. And and it wasn't just like, we'll drive the Jews out. You can see the language being used as the language is used by Hamas, where they're quoting the Quran and the Hadith, and the day of redemption will not come until the Arabs make war against the Jews and Muslims make war against the Jews and kill them. And a tree in Iraq will say, "O Muslim, O servant of Allah, there is a Jew behind me, come and kill him."
Right.
Their charter calls for the destruction of a Jewish state, as did the Palestine Liberation Organization, founded in 1964 by the KGB through the Romanian secret police, also call for the destruction of a Jewish state. They weren't calling back then, by the way, and they're not calling for today any two-state solution. The only people
Right.
calling for this two-state solution are the Westerners, the
Right.
America and the Europeans.
Right.
They're
You'll
calling for a
never
one-state
hear.
solution.
Yeah, you'll never hear a state policy of Palestinian body saying we're 100% for a two-state solution. I think that's really important. And I think we can't underestimate also the existential pressure on the psyche of the Jewish people when they're dealing with it's like it would be the equivalent of living in your country and having entire cities declare that their living purpose is to wipe everybody else out. And they're stating this as the policy of their city. We're here to get rid of all of you. And that the imprint on the psyche of the Jewish people, of the Israelis at that time, that's terrifying, especially when you're the minority. You're you're half the amount of the people there. And you also have people who have experienced Europe. They're also coming, some from the Holocaust, but also many from places where there's constantly been pogroms, and they've come to Israel to try to make a place where you're safe. And now your neighbors are consistently saying, hey, by the way, we hate you and we want to kill you, and we're hoping that you get completely wiped out. So we can't, being on the defensive, which I think is really interesting when we think about it, it's the Israeli defensive forces, right? Like being on the defensive has been a necessary stance, because what do you do when you're hanging out with people all the time who say, we're here to kill you and we're writing it down and putting it in our constitution?
Exactly. And again, you pointed out the microtizing of the conflict of, it's mighty Israel versus the Palestinian Authority. Now we see very clearly that, Hezbollah in the north and all these in Iraq and in Syria, all these militias and the Houthis, those guys in Yemen and Hamas, they're all part of a much larger struggle where Iran is at the core of this. And
Right.
so it's not just, as the UN described in the Gaza war, as Israel also condemns the firing of primitive rockets from Gaza at Israel. It's like these are like firecrackers that can't really damage
Right.
Israel. We're constantly in a state of existential threat. That's, I don't remember who said it originally, but that famous line which sums up everything about the peace process. If the Arabs would lay down their weapons, there'd be peace, and if Israel would lay down her weapons, she'd be destroyed. We are dealing with not just Hamas and Hezbollah on the border. We're dealing with very big attempts by much larger operators to destroy the Jewish state. The fact that Israel remains one of the happiest countries in all surveys in the world is pretty unbelievable. Right. Given the trauma we have collectively had in our history, which is epigenetically embedded in a lot of us as Jews, and the fact that we've been fighting for our existence in the Middle East and only wanting to peacefully coexist amongst people who really don't want to accept us, and given the fact that whenever they have finally reluctantly said, okay, we'll tolerate you, we make peace with them and we give them stuff. There's standards that are constantly being used against Israel, which have no other historical precedent, and no other country would be asked to do this stuff. Like, Israel's the only country in the world that fights wars for its survival since its inception, that it doesn't start, that it wins, and then is treated as if it's the aggressor and lost and has to give territory back. And that Israelis continually push for peace. The sad thing about Ellie, what happened in October 7th was some of the biggest pro-Palestinian peace activists were killed and kidnapped from these kibbutzim. These are people bringing little Arab kids to be treated for cancer, and constantly doing projects. And we're like the eternal optimists, even to the point of insanity. Like, we keep they will change their mind. But again, like you said perfectly, no people, if you had a neighbor who's across the other side of your fence, who's like with a shotgun, taking shots at your house when your family's sitting in the living room and yelling, I'm going to kill you guys. Got a vicious dog that tries to attack your kids. What you would say, oh, hi.
Right. Let me give you free food, free water, free electricity, and pay for all your bills and make sure that you have medical care. Like, it's a bit crazy. And I think the other piece for me that's really interesting is that this narrative that Ilan Pappe's book puts across completely absolves the Arab and Palestinian population of any responsibility for the conflict. And I think that's really binary.
Yeah, exactly. It's not, they call it the Nakba. When it's the tragedy, the War of Independence is the tragedy for them. Israel is celebrating its recreation of a Jewish state for the first time in 2,000 years, but it's a tragedy because it came at our expense. And again, did the Arabs pay a heavy price for it? Yes, but it's their fault. Like, the Gazans have paid a heavy price for October 7th. Yes, but it's their fault.
Meaning it could have been different.
Yeah, there wouldn't have been a war. There wouldn't have been any of the refugees. None of this stuff would have, no debating that. What Ilan Pappe would like to do is he's just like self-flagellation, that Israel's illegitimate, Jews have no right to a state, and we're like the Nazis of the Middle East, just trying to destroy the India. It's a lie built on a lie, built on a lie, built on a distortion. And I'm sorry, it's just not that way. And just because people can quote, that's the problem with, I did the same thing with Norman Finkelstein. He loves to quote statistics and facts to show that, look at all these surveys and international bodies have condemned Israel. But look at how biased most of the international bodies are. Amnesty International and UN and you name it. They have an automatic voting majority to condemn Israel, which they've done more than every other country in the world combined.
Yeah, I mean, the Security Council is, filled with genocidal maniacs who are passing judgment on Israel. That seems crazy. It's like asking a bunch of murderers whether or not, like, someone's guilty. Yeah. It's just very strange.
Like really, the Human Rights Council, let's put like China and, let's put these countries on the Human Rights Council, when they're putting like 1 million Uyghurs in concentration camps. The fact that we Jews, Ellie, believe reality is not a popularity contest. And the world could be very insane and saying stupid things. And, now you have the intersectional stuff, which only makes it harder to get clarity. Because when you paint Israel as there's only two sides to this, and one is totally wrong. Israel's painted as the vestigial, leftover colonialist white people oppressing the dark-skinned. In the intersectional left-wing view of today, we have to be guilty. So it's only It's like
Right.
pouring salt in a wound that's already there. It's just becoming
Yeah,
worse
and
and
I
worse and
think,
worse.
and the challenge of that is you can never actually talk about things that need clarifying or healing or dealing with because you're just talking in extremes. There's no nuance. There's no chance for anyone to take responsibility for their part in something when you're just painting people as good and evil. And so,
Exactly.
whatever work could be done is not going to be done because one side is just continuing to defend themselves against existential threat. And the other side is, not taking any responsibility for their part in the conflict. So it's a really difficult binary that doesn't leave a lot of it just makes it a knot and it's really hard to get out of. And I think people like Ilan Pappe
Exactly.
don't do any service either to the Palestinians or to peace in general when all they do is present some type of strange binary narrative that absolves one side of all responsibility.
Exactly. And they're backed up by a lot of governments in the West and a lot of the politicians on certain sides of the political spectrum and a lot of the mainstream media and not being called out. Think about it. Hamas knows today that we can keep launching missiles and keep doing what we're doing. And as long as people buy into that narrative and paint Israel as the aggressor and the genocidal maniacs who are disproportionately responding, and people keep saying, and we keep throwing out nonsense statistics about civilian deaths and everything, and they know that they can keep misbehaving with the backing of the world that doesn't want to make the effort to really try and objectively understand that there are facts and a reality here that needs to be understood. And if you approach a discussion already with a bias that this is the way it is and no amount of truth or fact will move me away from that, you're never going to get, you said it perfectly, we're never going to get to any solution to this problem. My Rosh Hashiva, Rav Noach Weinberg, the founder of Eshet Torah, he had a great line. I don't believe it was his original line, but it was one of his watchwords. He said, all men of good intention will reason together and come to a common conclusion. And good intention has to be both sides want peace. If my intention is I want you dead and there's nothing you can do to convince me otherwise, then no amount of the other side offering things up is ever going to do anything except weaken their position by giving you stuff which you're then going to use against you if it's territory or whatever. So
you have to have two people coming to the table in good faith.
Right. So if the world would call out Hamas and their genocidal intent towards Israel and say, guys, this is all your fault, I can promise you'd see a creation of a much more normative center in the Palestinian population, recognizing, guys, this isn't getting us anywhere. But they figure we can keep doing this forever. And eventually Israel will beat them. Eventually we'll wear them down. And it's not how it's going to work. So it really calls for people investing the time to recognize that it's not all one way or another, but there's certain facts and there's a reality that is indisputable. And it's not just those are your facts.
Right.
We have to make a commitment individually and collectively to want to live in reality and have clarity. And then only with that can we possibly get to a situation where we can get any kind of real peace and stability, not just in Israel, but any situation in the world today.
Right. Right. Yeah. And I think in the end, address the religious imperative that is driving the most motivating force, which is that Jews aren't allowed to be in an Islamic region. So I think that's a big piece of the puzzle also.
Exactly. Although Ellie, have to say, even from the Quranic perspective, I always tell everyone, Israel and Bnei Israel is mentioned multiple times, dozens of times in the Quran. And Jerusalem is not mentioned anywhere, even though we mention it 669 times in the Hebrew Bible. If you go to the Quran, you will see that in Surah 5, chapter 5, verse 21, the Quran, even though Jews have to be, and Christians who are dhimmi, who are second-class people, are supposed to live under Islamic authority. And as you said correctly, even though territory that becomes that Islamic world is not supposed to go back the other way, which Israel in the last 75 plus years, it still says in the Quran, chapter 5, verse 21, enter my holy people. And this is exactly, the context is Jewish people. This is the story of the Exodus. Enter my holy people and inherit the land God has given you. So even from the Islamic perspective, and as you point out really beautifully, that until the Islamic world, and I always say this, there are definitely moderate Muslims in this world, but Islam is not a moderate faith and can be interpreted very radically. And until the Islamic world is able to create an opposition to radical Islam being preached by like Iran and ISIS and the Houthis and Hezbollah and Hamas, and create, which we know it's capable of because it used to be that way 1,000 years ago. And what the West should be doing is being able to openly speak about Islam and the problems it's having. And we should merit to see what the Christian world did, which was to go from, the Dark Ages and very intolerant, a lot of intolerance and closed-minded worldview to a much more too open, in my opinion, perspective. Islamic world really needs to do the same thing. And that's what the West, the greatest service the West could do would be to go to basically crush Iran, which is the greatest source of terrorism, and to really push in a non-coercive, not colonialist way, but to create a normal kind of tolerant Islamic worldview, which would allow for the freedom and of religious worship and political freedom of other peoples, whether it's living in the Islamic world or living outside it. Then we get a much more stable world, and definitely be better for the Jewish people in Israel, and for them too.
100%, especially for the women. Yeah. All right. So I mean, I feel like every piece of this discussion could have become an episode in itself. So there's so many, great parts. We would love to hear from people who are listening. We would love to hear from you, ideas for topics, things that you'd like us to talk about, what you thought about this conversation. Please rate, share this with friends. And I believe there are some episodes that are starting to be put up on YouTube. Is that right?
There are, absolutely. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel.
Yeah. Awesome. So you can find it under Ken Spiro, I think.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. So we'll put the link in the liner notes. And you can find us and at any of those contact points. Thank you so much, Rabbi Ken Spiro. As always, super fascinating. And thanks everyone for joining.
So much, Ellie.